everybody. Sorry for the late start. I'd like to welcome you all to All About Black and White, presented by Joel Wolfson. Hi, Joel.
Hey, Nicole. Hi, everybody. Welcome, everyone. Hopefully you can see my screen here. Thanks for joining us today. The title of today's webinar is All About Black and White, but that title might be a bit deceiving because we need more than just black and white effects, for instance, to make great black and white images. In fact, many of the techniques I'll show you apply to all images, not just black and white. One of the advantages of creating black and white from digital capture is that we're starting from a color image and we can use all of that information to craft just the right black and white. So I'll be showing you several of my favorite plugins today, like Adjust and Clarity and Detail, and of course black and white effects. And if I can time it right, I'm going to slip in INRI Mask on the last image that I show you so we can get a nice selection and array of plugins that you would use. Nicole is going to provide a link to download my top 10 black and white tips and techniques at the end of the webinar, as well as some presets that I've created. I think she's going to send that out in the email. So in case you haven't taken one of my webinars before, I just wanted to mention that I have a number of educational resources such as my blog, newsletter, archives of these webinars, tips and techniques, etc., and they're all free. The best way to make use of these is to sign up on my email list, which you'll have my website and everything at the end when Nicole puts it up there on the screen. You can sign up either on my website or my blog also. And the other thing I would recommend is Topaz's Pro Insights. I submit some articles there, but there are also lots of other pros that have lots of great tips and techniques to share. If you've seen my webinars before, or taken my workshops, you know that Lightroom is my hub. That's what you see in front of you. And you'll find out that if you take one of my, let's say my black and white workshop where you read the top 10 tips, you'll see that I say that most successful black and white images are done when you shoot with the intention of black and white. So that's not to say that you can't discover a shot that you did originally with color in mind that ends up being a nice black and white, but your success rate is higher with that actual intention behind it. So that said, I'm going to start on my first image here. This is just a simple portrait of a baby's feet, and I did a pretty good job of selective focus to accentuate the feet. But this is kind of a classic case of color actually being a little distracting. Our main part of the image, of course, is a portrait of the feet and the baby being held in the arm, so the contrast of the mother's arm, both for the scale and the tone and all that. But it's almost distracting having the color in there with that big blob of red in the background, and it kind of makes the viewer's eye go back and forth. So what we're after is this right here, a black and white version, and I'll show you how I get there. And you can see right away that that bright red blob that was in the original color image, you don't even see it anymore because it's just a tone of gray and not prominent at all. So what I'm going to do is go through Photoshop. Now, my little rule of thumb, I could launch directly from Lightroom into Clarity, but my little rule of thumb is that if I'm going to be using more than one plugin, then I like to be able to put those in layers. So each effect I do, I can put in a different layer, and that requires a program that has layers, like something like Photoshop. Now, if I were just going to use one plugin, there's no reason not to go directly into it right from Lightroom. So the nice thing about the Topaz plugins is they have that capability. So I can either go up to the photo menu here, say Edit In, and then I'm going to go into Photoshop. Another way to do it is just to right-click on the image, either in the main view or down in the film strip, and then I can say Edit In, and I end up in the same place, Photoshop. And so I'll edit with a copy here. Now, the first thing I do is make a new layer. So I duplicate my background layer right here. There are a number of ways to do that. Just like with everything else in Photoshop, you usually have a few ways to do it. You can drag and drop, like I'm going to do right now, to the dog ear icon, and that makes a duplicate. I like to immediately change the name and put in what I'm going to do. So what I'm doing here is going into clarity, and my main purpose, and I'm going to just write that in, is to add a sense of depth, and we'll do a little bit more in there too, and I'll show you momentarily. So now with that layer selected down here in the lower right, I'm going to go up to the filter menu at the top of the screen here, scroll down to Topaz Labs, and scroll down to Clarity, and that will bring me into the Clarity plugin. So I will do a quick overview of the plugin. The first thing I like to do when I get into any plugin is find the reset button and click on that. Now in most cases it's going to be in the lower right here, and reset brings me back to a neutral point. What happens is that with a lot of the plugins, when you go into them, they will default to the last used settings, and that's pretty handy if you're doing the same thing to multiple images. If not, I like to make that habit of hitting the reset. So just to give you a quick overview, over on the left we have collections of presets. So the collections those are groups of different presets, and then below are the individual presets for those groups. Right now, excuse me, I'm in one called My Collection. And these are presets that I've created myself. Now there's other ones here. I can click on General and it gives me those. You can click on them to see what they do, or if you want to get a sample, if you look here, there's a grid icon, and you'll see that in several of the Topaz plugins. And right now it's preparing the preview so that it can give me a layout in a grid form of all the different presets that are in that group. So it's whatever group you have highlighted. So here we are with all the different choices, and you can just scroll through these and pick out the one that you think looks best for your image. I am going to go in back to my collection because I want to show you a preset that is going to be available to you that I created, and that one is simply called Add Depth, and that's right here. I've got my name on it so you know it's the one that I created, since there could be more than one out there called Add Depth. But the idea here is to get a little more dimension. This image as it is comes from the raw file, and as many of you have heard me say before, raw is blah. So raw images by their very nature come out of the camera looking rather lackluster, and we need to get back some of the saturation and contrast. And in fact, when we're doing black and white, it's often helpful to make the image a little more contrasty and a little more saturated than you would if you were doing a color image, so that it ends up even looking a little bit gaudy. The one area where you have to be a little careful of that are portraits. Now this isn't a face portrait, so it's not quite as critical, and definitely in landscapes and architecture and things like that, you can really add a lot of saturation and contrast to your image to get a nice black and white conversion. But what I'm going to do is start with this one called Add Depth, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. So over on the right are the actual controls. So when I clicked on that preset, it changed all these sliders. And the crux of this program, the real beauty of it and the power, is over in this dynamics with the different levels of contrast. Clarity is a contrast program, so it allows you to really tweak the various areas of contrast, from micro contrast, which are areas of very little difference in contrast, all the way up to high contrast. And if you just want to get an idea, I'll take this micro contrast slider, I'll move it all the way to the right. It's not going to look at all like we want it to look, but it gives you an idea. It's taking areas that normally would look kind of smooth and not have much in the way of texture, and it really adds a lot of texture to it. And that's great if we were going for some kind of special effect here, but we're not, so I'm going to bring this back down. And you'll find with this preset, if you try it out later on, I do very little in the micro and low contrast areas. It turns out that if you want to get a sense of depth, it typically is going to be by boosting in the medium contrast. And the high contrast, actually, I will very often go to the negative area, because if there's already a great difference in contrast, it gets accentuated as you go through the other sliders, and so oftentimes things kind of equalize out when you go to the high contrast, or when you bring the high contrast down. you can always look at a histogram and see where your levels are. Now this particular image is really a lot of just middle tones. It's not a super high contrast image, but we're going to work on it just a tad more before we go to black and white effects. So about the only other thing I want to do is, if we're just looking at this image and imagining how it's going to turn to black and white, the really important part of the image is right in here with the mother's arm and the feet, and so we really want to make sure we have some differentiation, because that's sort of, you know, part of what makes this interesting is the contrast between the mother's arm and the scale, and then the difference in the tone of the skin too. So what I'm going to do is make her arm differentiate itself, make it sort of darker and more saturated than the baby's feet. And so if you look down here, I clicked on this hue, saturation, luminance, and this is a really nice thing about this plugin, is it separates out all the colors, and I can adjust them individually for hue, saturation, and luminance on each color. And then I have an overall slider as well. So if I wanted to, say, change the overall hue or bring up the overall saturation, I can do that. Now, I would guess that most of these tones are going to be in the orange or yellow, and the way you can test it is just by moving the slider. If I change what I think is the orange and you see a big change, then we know. I'm interested in saturation and luminance to start. So I'll start with the luminance, which is sort of the lightness or darkness, and you can see if I bring it down, it makes it very dark. And what I'm going to do is bring it down just a little bit to make her arm a little bit darker. And then the saturation, I'm going to use the orange slider and boost it up just a little bit. Now that is not very natural looking skin tone, but we're still thinking in terms of converting it to black and white here. So you just have to kind of bear with me, and if you haven't tried this before, just take my word for it that this little bit of extra contrast or a little extra saturation boost here is going to help us differentiate when it comes to grayscale and tonality in a black and white image. So I am going to say OK, and what it's going to do is process it and bring it back in. So if you want to see the difference, over in the lower right-hand corner where my layers are, I can just click on the eyeball. That will turn off the layer that I just made, that clarity layer, and you can see the difference between the original image and where we've gone, and that should give us a nice conversion to black and white. So I want to duplicate the layer again. This time I'll do Command J, it's Control J on a PC, and I'm going to relabel it and say black and white effects, because that's what we're going into next. So that's the next plugin, and that's the key one for converting to black and white. Now if we've done our work here, when I go into black and white effects, it should start off with a pretty nice conversion just in the neutral. And again, it prepares the previews. I'm going to go down, first thing I'm going to do, go to the lower right here, click on reset, and that brings it back to a totally neutral image. So this is, it'll default to sort of a neutral conversion. And what I'm going to do here is, I'm in the traditional collection. So the layout is actually pretty much the same. So if you go over here on the left, there's all the different collections. And then in each of those collections, if you click on one, let's say we click on Platinum, it'll build the previews for all these. Again, we can click on this grid icon here, and it gives us a whole bunch of choices. Now I clicked on the Platinum collection, so these are all simulate Platinum Palladium prints or Platinum printing, whatever. And I could just click on one of these and choose it. What I'm going to do is I'm kind of going for a straight black and white here. So I'm going to go up to the traditional collection. Now I'm going to click on the grid here, and this way we can go through and pick it up. Now what I'll tell you is that usually my go-to is classic, and that works for an awful lot of black and whites, and I like that as a starting point. And these presets really are great for using as starting points. But as I'm going through here, I think actually what I like is just the neutral grayscale, and like I say, that's sort of an exception that that would be my first choice, because it usually needs a little more work beyond that, and I will give it just a little bit. But if I go, so anyway, presets on the left just like before, And I've got my tools on the right, and I just want to go through these a little bit. So in the upper right, we have our preview window, and we can change that based on these up here, and I'll get to that in a few minutes or maybe on the next image. These different colored circles are for filters. So if you want to put on a yellow filter, for instance, you can just click on the yellow. It'll immediately throw on a yellow filter. Now, that made our skin tones too light, and I'm not really crazy about it, but just to show you how it works. So these are shortcuts to doing filters. You'll see below in these little dialogues that open up for each of the different sections, it automatically opened up the color filter one. I'm going to uncheck that because I don't want to use a color filter, but it's nice because once you choose one of those color filters, you can adjust it, and we're going to do that in another image later on. But the real one of the real keys to this is the adaptive exposure, which those of you who have used Topaz's Adjust are familiar with that. And the adaptive exposure is sort of like magic exposure equalization. And the two key controls in here are the adaptive exposure and the regions. So if I do, as I bring up the adaptive exposure, it actually, unlike a standard exposure slider, it doesn't blow out highlights or block up shadows as you increase exposure. It does it adaptively, and then regions work in conjunction with that. So if you have one region, it treats the whole thing as one as you move this slider around. And what's nice about the regions is you can kind of match it to your type of image. So if you have an image with a lot of differing pockets of different exposure, you can increase the number of regions, and essentially it applies the adaptive exposure to each section separately and then merges them together. It's almost like a piece of graph paper or a grid overlaid on your image, and then it adjusts each of those tiles separately and then brings them all back together. So in this case, I'm a little high on the adaptive exposure here. I'm not really looking for any big changes, so I'll bring it down a little bit. And another little rule of thumb I have here, if you're not sure where to start with the regions, often a good place to go is similar to the number you have above. So if you have 20 up here, then you might want to use 20 in the regions for a starting point, and that'll tend to smooth things out when you have a lot of different areas of exposure in the image. So really, I'm pretty much done here. What I'm going to do is, if I hold down the space bar, this is a shortcut to getting the before. So there's the before image. Now, it was pretty good just right out of the chute because we did a lot of the work in clarity. There's my after, and I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm going to say OK. And then if I go ahead and save this, and then go back into Lightroom, it should save it back into Lightroom, and there it is. So I'm going to compare these two just so you can see a before and after. And there we are. On the right is our original color image, and as I mentioned, that the color is actually almost distracting from the portrait, and then on the left we have just a real nice black and white portrait. All right, so I will go to the next image here, and we'll add a little more in terms of adjustments to this so you can see some other things. I'm going to start with this image here. I shot this not far from my studio at Wapaki National Monument, and this is classic high desert. Let me get rid of these down here so you can see it a little better. Most people go there for the ruins, but I think there's lots of great shots of the prairie and the plateaus. And there's something in this image that's rare for us in Arizona, and that's clouds in the sky. When I lived in the Midwest, I yearned for clear blue skies, but here it's a real treat to get clouds in your photos with the blue skies. But again, the real center of interest here is the clouds, and I shot this thinking in terms of black and white, and so that's really where I'm going with this. Again, I'm going to start in clarity because we have this same sort of lackluster thing going on from the raw image. It's that raw is blah. And so I'm going to bring, because I'm using multiple plugins, I'm going to go into Photoshop again. And I'm going to use essentially the same plugins I did before, but just show you some more adjustments and things we can do with it. So what I'm going to do is duplicate my layer here. I'm going to rename it and call this one Clarity. And I will go to Filter, Topaz Labs, bring us back into Clarity. And so now we're working on that layer. I'm going to reset now. Going over on the left here, I'm in my collection, and if you scroll down, you see I have this one which I'm going to share with you guys called Black and White Preparation Land, or Black and White Prep Landscape. And I'm going to click on this, and then I'll explain what's happening here. So you remember that I said that we want something a little bit more saturated and a little bit contrastier than usual, or than we would do with just a color image. So what I've got here is, if you look on the right, I've increased the contrast quite a bit in the first three, and then in the high contrast, I haven't taken it down into the negative where I often would, and the reason is I'm trying to maintain the contrast here. Now if I click on the histogram and look at it, if you look at the histogram, you can see we're not going too far on the extremes. And what we can do, though, is adjust them if we want to. So for instance, on the black and white level, those can be adjusted separately. If you notice, the black is up to 20. If I left that at 0, which is a default, if you watch, the darks really go dark in the image, and if you look up at the histogram, they're running off the end of the scale here. So that's one thing that's really cool with this tone level adjustment, and I don't think we really touched on that before. So this is a way to really kind of tweak what's going on in the image after you've done these contrast adjustments in the dynamics section. And on the high contrast end, I might back off just a little bit. We can see what happens with the histogram here when we do. It's going to take a second to redraw it. And that's not bad. So if you look up at the histogram, you can see that I haven't really clipped any of my whites. We can always, excuse me, we can always add more contrast too when we get to black and white effects, but you remember we'll get our best conversion if we start out with a fair amount of contrast and saturation to begin with. So what I'm going to do is, I think this preset is a great starting point, and this, of course, is what it's made for. It's to prepare a landscape for black and white. So it really adds a lot to it, but I want to increase that even a little more. We happen to have sort of a reddish, orangish foreground here, so what I'm going to do in the colors here is I'm going to saturate the oranges and yellows to bring this out, and I might even just do a little overall. Now remember, we're kind of, whoops, I'm on the hue. My apologies. I'm going to go to saturation. Let me go back to hue. Get this back to where we're supposed to be. All right. And it's not cooperating. All right, we'll reset. All right, so start over again here. So we've got all those same settings up on top from my black and white prep preset, and I am going to go to saturation, and I'm going to bump up the orange here a bit, and I'm going to bump up the yellow, and you can see that's bringing up the colors down in here, and then I've got the overall up to like 15. So I've got a pretty darn saturated image. So there's where we started. There's the before, and there's the after, and I'm going to jump into black and white effects now. So we say OK, and we've got our somewhat gaudy color image, which should make a great starting point for black and white effects. I'm going to drag and drop and duplicate that, and let's see, we call that black and white effects. And now we'll go into Topaz Labs, black and white effects. I'm going to hit the reset again. And in this case, I'm going to go over the presets. I'm going to start with my favorite classic, and I think that looks really good right out of the chute. And it made a nice finished look from our somewhat gaudy file. We can go into our conversions here, take a look at the adaptive exposure, and about the only thing I might do is to raise the number of regions here just to kind of smooth things out a little bit. So I'm going to bring it up closer to that number. It's pretty subtle. If I click back and go to the 8, you can see the clouds are a little more contrasty. It kind of smooths them out a little bit when I bring the regions up closer to this same number that I have in adaptive exposure. That rule of thumb doesn't always work, but in this case it's working pretty well, and I'm getting some of that back in the clouds. The only other thing I want to do here is, because the clouds are the main interest in this photo, is I'm going to click on that yellow filter, and basically a yellow filter does double duty here because the foreground has a lot of yellow in it, and just like a real glass filter, which transmits and therefore lightens its own color and blocks or darkens its opposite, which is blue, we end up with a lighter foreground, darker sky. It's a little overdone here, in my opinion, so I'm going to bring down the strength, and we'll just bring that down a bit to make it a little less crazy. And I really like that because you've got a lot of nice texture, and it brings it out. So we're pretty much done here. The only thing I'm going to do is show you another set of tools up on here, and the key one is this zone system. So you click on the Z, and it gives you this set of numbers. For those of you that are not familiar with the zone system, it was popularized by Ansel Adams, and it basically divides a black and white photo into 10 tonal ranges, from 0, which is the blackest black you can get, to 9 or 10, depending what scale you're using, which is the whitest white. So no detail, no nothing, just pure white. If you were printing on paper, it would be the base white of the paper. And in the case of the blackest black you can possibly get on whatever media you're on. So what I like to do is just use this for a check, especially in the extreme. So if I click on the 10, it color codes it. You can see there's no detail in this, and the cool thing is that I can go ahead and adjust that. So if I go into my exposure, my adaptive exposure here, I can go under protect highlights, and you can sort of watch that red area disappear. What I'm doing is bringing back some of the detail that was in here that we lost, and by the time I'm up to the 12, I just have a tiny bit here. I can double check and see, the other levels too, and they're all color coded differently, so you can see the different zones. In a lot of cases, I'm going to be checking my extremes when I'm adjusting this. So when I hit 0 and 1, I can see, here, I'll enlarge it for you so you can see better. Oops. But you can see the areas that are mapped out for the darkest tones here. And if I uncheck those and actually look at the tones, you can see we have a black, and then we have one that's just a little lighter. That's the number 1, and that's exactly the way it should be. This is actually lava out here, so it's got some tonality, but not a lot of detail. And then here's just a shadow with the blackest black. So this zone system thing is really cool for checking those things. My region slipped here. I'll go back to where I was, and we'll go back and look at an overall view. And I'm also going to hit the before here, and you can see that's where we started with a neutral black and white conversion, and this is where we ended up. I'll bring this filter down again. This is where we ended up with our adjustment after. Here, let me do this. Is the before, there's the after. and we've got a lot of drama and contrast in there, which is nice. So here we are back in our Photoshop with the layers. I'm going to undo those so you can see where we started with the color image before we did any adjustments to it. Then with clarity, where we got that sort of somewhat gaudy look, and then our black and white. And so I'm going to go back to Lightroom here, and we'll do a quick comparison. So there's where we started on the left, and there's our nice black and white on the right, where we got those nice tonal values just through a couple of quick plugins. So let's see. I'm going to try to get to one more image here really quickly. Let me get out of my comparison mode here. And I'm going to do this image. So this is in Wyoming. I shot this in the Tetons, and you're probably wondering, why does Joel want a photo that's hazy with flare in it? And the answer is that I shot this knowing it would be a black and white, and basically when I'm done, it's going to look like this. Okay, so the reason I actually played around with this to try to get veiling flare as opposed to direct flare, and that way we just have these kind of streaks you can see from the sun. And what I like about this scene is the timeless feel. These buildings could be 100 years old, and there really isn't much in the photo to identify a particular point in time. By giving it a sepia tone treatment and this sort of look with a film film edge on it, there's no way to know whether someone shot it on a view camera at the turn of the century or yesterday. So I kind of like that whole concept there, and so that's where I'm going with it, starting from here. So let's go into, now where I'm going to go in, this is one that definitely needs some exposure equalization because we have strong backlighting. It's overall maybe a little bit dark. I did that so the highlights wouldn't blow out, and knowing also that I have a great tool like Topaz Adjust to do my exposure equalization. So I'm going to go hop into Photoshop, and this time the first plugin that I'm going to use is going to be Adjust. So first I want to duplicate my layer. I'm going to mark this Adjust, and this is going to be exposure equalization along with a few other things that we can do in Adjust. There's Adjust. Okay, I'm going to hit Reset. And again, the layout is pretty much the same. So we have our collections and presets over on the left. We have our main tools, and a lot like we saw in black and white effects is adaptive exposure, and that is really the key to this program, and it's the real beauty and the real magic of it. It's the only thing out there I know like it that really does this sort of magic exposure equalization. So this is another preset that you guys will have, or that I'm sharing with you, and you can download. I believe that Nicole is sending it along with the follow-up email. So it's called OneStep Raw Optimize. So again, we're dealing with an image from a raw file, and so I'm going to click on that, and that gets me started, but I still want to add a few things to this. So I'm going to bring up my adaptive exposure. I'll add a few regions to it, and my shadows are a little dark. I'm just going to take a quick look at the histogram there. I mean, it looks pretty good on there, but it looks like we could be cutting some of the shadows off here, whereas the highlights just kind of fall off the way they should, sort of on the endpoints there. And I'm going to use the protect shadows and just bring that up just a little bit. And also you notice there's a detail section, and that allows us, let me enlarge this so you can see. I'm going to bring it down here. So you can see the sagebrush and the bison and stuff here. If I look at it before, there's before and there's my after, and you can see it's added some sharpness. I can independently just uncheck the detail box so you can get a true before and after of just the detail section. And there it is for the after. And so it's adding a little more contrast that way, which is what we want for the conversion, and it's also sharpening it a little bit. So we're sort of in one step doing our exposure adjustment and some capture sharpening. And also you notice the color box is checked in my preset here too, and I think that's probably pretty good. The only thing I might do here though, I'm going to bring this back down, and I am going to actually bring the regions down in this case so that it kind of adds a saturation overall. And I might I might even bring up the overall saturation just a little bit. We can do more of this when I go into clarity, because I still want to use clarity to get some of that sense of depth. So adjust has done a lot here. There's our original. And there we are back at the adjusted image, and I think that's a really big improvement, and it's taken care of a lot of the things here. So the next thing I want to do is go into clarity. So I'm going to make a copy of the layer we just did. I'm going to rename this one clarity, and then we're going to go in and get our sense of depth and see if we can't add a little bit more to this to make a good conversion. So I'm going to go into clarity. I'll reset this. Now, I have one here. Instead of the add depth, what I'm going to do, this is kind of a hazy. I have this other one called dehaze, and I have a normal, a heavy, and a plus. This is sort of in between, so I'll try the plus. And I think that looks pretty darn good. I'd say we're almost there. So if you look over at the controls again, you can see relative to last time where I was in the 20s, I'm in the 30s on all of these. And that's really bringing up that whole sense of depth and also adding a lot to the contrast here. So the only other thing I might do is, I don't mind if the whites go a little bit bright here, because I want to have a reason for this veiling flare. I'm not worried about the color here that's showing up, that sort of rainbowing effect, because that's going to go away in the black and white. So I'd say we're pretty good here. I'm going to say OK. And it's going to process the image and bring us back into Photoshop. So my next stop is actually, I want to increase the contrast and brightness a little bit more, but I kind of want to separate the mountains from the foreground, because if I bring the mountains to the point where I really want them, the foreground isn't going to be exactly right, because they're vastly different tonalities here. So one of the best ways to do that is to isolate these, is to mask it, and that's, I promised you I'd try to show you remask, so I'll just do that real quick. I'm going to go into Topaz Labs and go to Remask. I know some of you are wondering why I didn't duplicate the layer, and that's because there's an option in Remask that will automatically create a copy of the layer, and hopefully I have that selected. So here's the image, and this plugin looks a little bit different. I'll go over it real quick here, but basically it's pretty simple. Everything is on the left here for the most part, and it's the tools to mask. So it's color-coded. Red is what you cut, green is what you keep, and the blue is essentially the transition. That's your compute brush. So that's the edge along which you decide whether it cuts or keeps, and that's pretty much the crux of the program. So it's pretty simple. Up here are your tools, and I'm going to hit the magnify tool because I like to be at 100% when I'm doing this, and I'm just going, and you can change your brush size here. So you see I'm selected on the blue, which is the compute brush, and that determines our transition. So you can see I'm going to go along this line right here, just at the base of the trees. Now, instead of trying to draw this by hand, I'm going to show you a shortcut. When you have a long straight line like this, you can just go to your next point, hold down the Shift key, and click, and then I just created that line without having to spend all the time hand drawing it. And I'm going to use that same technique as I go across here, because I'm dealing with almost all straight lines here. And I'm going to go around these structures. Again, I'm just using this shift click technique here. And right here, I might have to hand draw it a little bit. And then I'm going to shrink it back down again. So now I want to, in this case, it doesn't matter that much whether I cut out the mountains or cut out the foreground, because I'm going to end up using both masks, and I'll show you how I do that in Photoshop. But basically, first thing I want to do is go down to the fill. So this is like the paint bucket in Photoshop. And I don't know, let's just for argument's sake say we're going to cut out the background. And so the green is keep, that's what we're keeping, and then the background we're cutting. I'm going to hit the compute mask. And that'll give us a pretty good mask. Now, you can see the mask right here. I can hit the split screen in the upper right here and then make these different views. So I'll say, okay, this is the keep. This background is really distracting. Luckily, you can pick a solid color. And if you want to do a different color, you can. I like the red because it's pretty much the opposite of green, which is what I'm seeing. And if I magnify, it makes it easy to see if there's any color bleed in there. And there isn't too much. It's not too bad. It makes a pretty good mask right off the bat. But you notice this magic brush thing appeared now. And so what that allows me to do is I can go in, and all I have to do is just touch the edge of one of these areas that needs a little touch up, and it sort of shrink wraps it right to the edge. And I can switch between the tools and create my mask that way. So when I'm satisfied that it's done, I say okay, and there's my mask along with my extra copy that it made. And what I'm going to do is create a levels layer so that I can make some adjustments. I'm just going to click and hold and copy that mask up there. I no longer need this layer. I'm going to get rid of that. And now I'm just going to make some adjustments in the levels. So for the foreground, I'm going to increase this a little bit and make it brighter. I think that's pretty good there. And then I'm going to make another levels layer. And this time I'm going to hold down the Option key or Alt on a PC to drag that up there, and that makes a duplicate. And then I do the Command or Control I to invert it. So now I have a mask and a levels layer instantly, all from Remask originally. And I can adjust this separately down here. And so now I'm darkening the mountains, and it's just affecting the mountains. You can see as I bring that in. So now I have a really good basis for my black and white effects. I will jump in there very quickly. And what I'm going to do is use the old Option key again, Alt on a PC, go down to here to merge visible, and what that does is it takes all the bottom layers and it stacks them together into a new layer, and we're going to use that for black and white effects. I'm going to go into black and white effects here. I'm going to hit reset, and I'll start with the classic, and I think that looks really good. And all I wanted to do here was add sepia tone, which here's another great thing in black and white effects, and that is you can hit click this, and it will instantly turn it into a sepia tone. It defaults. You can put any color you want in here, so you can tone it blue, you can tone it cyan, you can tone it whatever you want. It happens to default to a sepia colors. All I'm going to do is raise, you can see all the different parameters here. The paper tone strength is going to affect the highlights, and then the rest of it, the silver tone, is going to affect anything, grayish or basically anything that isn't a base white. and the overall strength I can adjust up here. So I'm going to make it just a little bit more. I want it just a little bit more sepia. And then for that film edge look, I go down to border down here. I click on that. It put on a solid white, which is not what I want, but I can go to this drop-down menu here, and as I hover over these, it shows me the different ones. And I'm going to go to grungy black and white too, because that gives me kind of that film edge look. And then I can adjust it. I can change the size here. So as I go down, it brings it out closer to the border. As I go in, it's cropping in a little, but giving me a little more white space. So someone there I think looks good, and that's our finished image. I'm going to say OK, and that should process this image and bring it back into Photoshop. Now if you go all the way back to where we started, that's where we started, and that's where we ended up. If you want to see the in-betweens, there's adjust, clarity, and then we used remask for that extra punch, and we really transformed this image from a backlit, flare-ridden image. And actually that veiling flare was a little tricky. I had to shoot several different shots, moving the camera just ever so slightly. But anyway, there's our final, and let me just compare those two, and then hopefully I have time for a few questions, and both for you, Nicole, and the audience, I am willing to just hang around for a few minutes extra since I ran really close to finish time here. But there's our before on the left, pretty dramatic difference, and our final result on the right. So voila.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joel. This has been great. If you want to follow Joel, you can do so at joelwolfson.com. If you want to check out his blog where he has a ton of great information and imagery, it's joelwolfson.com/blog, and his information is info@joelwolfson.com if you want to get connected. If you have any questions and you have to leave us right now and we weren't able to get to them, you can contact us at webinars@topazlabs.com. You can also sign up for upcoming sessions at topazlabs.com/webinars. All right, well, everybody, we're coming up on 15 minutes past the hour. Thank you so much, Joel, for sticking around. We've had a ton of awesome feedback from people really enjoying the session and just really enjoying all the information that you've given them today.
Well, great, and I've certainly enjoyed doing this, and thank you all very much for attending. I really appreciate it, and hope you'll come back for another one in the future.
Yes.
You all have a good day, a good night, wherever you are, whatever time zone.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you again, Joel.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.